Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at this really interesting booklet by Richard Nixon
Oh, wow.
from August 1960
Okay.
called The Meaning of Communism to Americans.
I've heard of this.
Yeah, and I think it's just so fascinating to get this perspective from Nixon,
Right.
who at the time was vice president,
Yes.
on
Yeah.
kind of this ideological clash with the Soviet Union.
Mm,
And one of the things that really struck me as I was reading through this was, Nixon wasn't just worried about
mhm.
bombs and missiles and, sort of the military strength of the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
He seemed to be really deeply concerned about the power of ideas
absolutely.
and how misunderstanding communism could actually make it seem appealing in some ways.
It's such a good point.
Oh, I
And
have
what strikes me is that he almost saw it as like a virus of the mind.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
it's not enough to just sort of fight communism on a battlefield. You really have to understand it. You have to almost dissect it in order to be able to combat it.
Yeah. I think he was laying out these stakes saying we need to understand this.
Mm.
But then he also gets into the nitty-gritty. He spends a big chunk of the booklet kind of analyzing the Soviet economic system
Right.
and pointing out what he saw as inherent flaws in this whole communist approach to economics.
And one of the interesting things is he kind of highlights this contradiction between the communist idea that a socialist economy shouldn't operate on the same principles as a free market.
Well, and, even Marx himself was sort of he admired the incredible productive power
Tough capitalism. Yeah.
of capitalism.
Okay.
And in fact, he even quotes from the Communist Manifesto, where Marx and Engels praised the bourgeoisie for developing things like the machinery
Right.
and the infrastructure.
So if they were so against this idea of a free market, then what was their plan for a socialist economy?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's surprising how little they actually say about it.
Oh, really?
Nixon actually points out that Marx and Engels were oddly silent on the specifics of how this is supposed to work. Wow, so it seems like when the Bolsheviks took over Russia, they were basically winging it.
Yeah, I mean, they were operating without any real guidance from the founders of their own ideology.
And that led to some disastrous consequences, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, their attempts to abolish the market
completely.
and go to full-on central planning
Yeah.
caused economic chaos and widespread famine.
Yeah, it was a total catastrophe. Millions of lives lost just in that initial experiment of trying to completely eliminate any kind of market forces.
It makes you wonder how any system that clashes so dramatically with what we understand about basic economic principles could be sustainable.
Well, and that's, I think, what's so interesting is that Nixon was already arguing that even back in 1960, the Soviet Union was drifting away from this purely communist economic model
Oh, really?
towards something that incorporated elements of a market.
Interesting.
They called it the method of balances,
Yeah.
but it was really this kind of hybrid system.
So even the Soviets, who were supposed to be this poster child for communism, were making concessions to the free market.
Yeah, it was like they were acknowledging the need for some level of market-based decision-making just to keep things afloat.
That's a pretty big admission that the ideology wasn't really working as intended.
Exactly.
So we've got this system that doesn't seem to be working on an economic level, but then there's this whole other layer to Nixon's argument, this idea that communism actually creates an illusion of freedom.
Yeah, he goes right at it. He argues that the ideology at its core is completely incompatible with individual freedom.
Right.
This whole concept of a dictatorship of the proletariat, which is how they justified their one-party system,
Right.
is inherently authoritarian.
It sounds like a bit of a double speak situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like they're claiming to represent the working class,
Right.
but at the same time suppressing anyone who questions the party line.
He even brings up this really fascinating story of a Soviet legal scholar named Pashukanis,
Okay.
whose career was basically destroyed because he took seriously this communist idea of law
Yeah.
eventually withering away.
Wait, so they punished him for believing in their own ideology?
Yeah, it seems crazy, right? But it really highlights the hypocrisy
Wow.
of the system that was in place.
They're preaching about empowering the people,
Right.
but at the same time, they're ruthlessly silencing any dissenting voices.
Exactly.
It's almost like saying we'll have a society without rules or laws, which sounds appealing in theory, but in reality, you need some kind of structure and order.
Right. You need some kind of framework.
And the irony is they actually boasted about their one-party system
I
as
know.
being the only true democracy in the world.
Well, of course, when there's only one party to vote for, you're guaranteed to win.
Right. It sounds more like a dictatorship with extra steps.
Exactly. And Nixon was pointing out the absurdity of that claim.
Yeah.
Saying true democracy requires free choice
Mm.
and the ability to challenge those in power.
So we've got this shaky economic foundation and this very questionable claim to freedom. It makes you wonder why communism was so appealing to people.
That's the million-dollar question. And it's one that Nixon tries to answer in the next part of the booklet, where he actually delves into the psychological and emotional appeal of the communist ideology.
He identifies three key ingredients to communist faith. He calls it freedom from dread, a belief in a shared purpose, and a sense of being lifted above everyday concerns.
Hmm.
And I think that these are such powerful motivators, even if the system itself is ultimately flawed.
Oh, absolutely.
So let's break those down a bit,
Yeah.
because I think there's a lot to unpack there. And it might help us understand why certain ideologies still resonate with people even today.
Absolutely. And we'll get into that in the next part of our deep dive. Picking up where we left off with those three ingredients to communist faith: freedom from dread, belief in a shared purpose, and a sense of being lifted above those everyday concerns.
Yeah, I mean, those are pretty powerful motivators, even if you think the system itself is flawed.
I think you're absolutely right. And especially in the context of the Cold War, this communist narrative had a really strong appeal.
Especially for people who felt like they'd been left behind by the system.
Yeah. Or who were looking for kind of a radical change.
Like this idea that you can join this movement that will fix all the world's problems.
Yeah, create a utopia where everyone is happy and equal and cared for.
Right. It sounds really seductive, even if it's not realistic.
Absolutely. And Nixon understood this. He was very astute in recognizing that to combat communism, you couldn't just focus on the flaws.
Right.
You had to address why people found it appealing in the first place.
You can't just dismiss people and say, oh, you're irrational or you're foolish.
Right. You have to really engage with their concerns and understand what's motivating them.
So how did Nixon propose to counter that appeal? Did he have any concrete strategies?
He did actually. He argued for a multifaceted approach
Okay.
that combined military strength with economic prosperity
Right.
and an unwavering commitment to democratic values.
He wasn't just talking about winning on the battlefield. He was talking about winning hearts and minds.
Exactly. He wanted to showcase that America could offer a better deal, freedom opportunity, a system that actually works.
Right.
And by doing that, you could undermine the allure of this communist utopia.
But he didn't stop there, right? I mean, he also talked about the need for vigilance,
Oh, absolutely.
even as communism seemed to be maybe weakening.
He warned that even a weakened communist movement could still pose a threat.
It could exploit vulnerabilities.
It could adapt its tactics
Right.
and use any means necessary to advance its agenda.
It's like a reminder that you can't just sit back and relax and declare victory.
Right, you have to be constantly vigilant.
We can't be naive when it comes to threats to our way of life.
Right, eternal vigilance.
And vigilance requires that you understand the ideologies that you're up against.
Absolutely, you have to know their strengths, their weaknesses, their appeal.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the economic problems with communism to the psychological appeal, and then Nixon's kind of counter strategies.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say are some of the key takeaways for our listeners to keep in mind?
Well, first, I think it's important to remember that Nixon's analysis is a product of its time.
Right.
You have to view his arguments through the lens of the Cold War context.
And the world has changed a lot since then.
Oh, absolutely.
So we can't just take his words and apply them uncritically to the present.
Right.
But I also think there's some really valuable lessons that we can learn from his work.
For sure.
Like his focus on the power of ideas,
Mm-hmm.
that recognition that people are looking for simple solutions.
Yeah, to very complex problems.
And they're drawn to these grand narratives.
Exactly.
And his call to defend democratic values, I think that's something that still resonates today.
Absolutely.
It's a reminder that this battle of ideas, it never really ends.
Right.
And we all have a role to play in defending what we believe in.
And that defense requires more than just, slogans and sound bites.
It requires that we actually understand opposing viewpoints.
Yes.
And that we engage in civil discourse.
That we find common ground where we can...
So it's more about building bridges than walls.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting, right?
Yeah.
How do we effectively counter these ideologies without resorting to the same kind of divisive rhetoric?
It's a tough question.
Yeah, but it's one we have to grapple with.
And maybe Nixon's insights can give us a place to start.
I think so.
We'll dig into that a bit more in the final part of our deep dive. All right, so we're back. And we've talked about a lot with this Nixon booklet, the meaning of communism to Americans. We talked about how he saw these contradictions within the ideology itself.
Right.
The problems with the economics. We've talked about how he saw it as an illusion of freedom.
Yeah.
And we even talked about how, despite all of that, he recognized that it still had this appeal for a lot of people.
Right.
So I kind of want to shift gears now and think about how Nixon looked at the future of communism. Like, did he see this as just kind of a temporary blip? Or did he see it as this long-term ideological adversary that we were going to have to contend with?
Well, I think he definitely believed that communism as an ideology was ultimately unstable, a system that would eventually crumble under its own weight.
Okay, so he saw the seeds of its own destruction in a way,
Yeah, he did.
kind of embedded within the ideology itself.
Yeah, like the suppression of freedoms, the
Wow.
suppression of individual initiative,
Right.
the inefficiency of a centrally planned economy. All those things he saw as eventually leading to its downfall.
It's like he was saying communism looks powerful now, but it's built on this foundation of sand.
Exactly. And, he predicted that as the Soviet Union modernized, as its citizens had more exposure to the outside world,
Right,
they would start to see the cracks in that facade.
right.
And the appeal of freedom and prosperity would outweigh those empty promises of utopia.
But he also injected this note of caution, right? He didn't think it was just going to vanish overnight.
No, he was very clear about that. He warned that even a weakened communist movement can still be a threat.
Okay.
They could adapt their tactics, they could exploit vulnerabilities, they could use any means necessary to advance their agenda.
Like, don't let your guard down.
Right, exactly.
It wasn't a time to relax and declare victory.
No.
It was a call to action.
Yeah.
A reminder to stay vigilant
Be proactive.
and defend our values.
Absolutely.
And his solution to that was multi-pronged, right?
Yes.
He talked about military strength, but also economic prosperity and a commitment to democratic values.
Yeah, it was a really comprehensive approach.
Just like he was saying, we have a better path.
Mm-hmm.
We have a system that works better, that respects individual liberty,
Exactly.
that allows you to reach your full potential.
And I think ultimately he believed that by showcasing the tangible benefits of that system, the U.S. could successfully counter communism.
Okay, so now that we know kind of what he was predicting,
Yeah.
how did those predictions actually hold up?
Well, in a lot of ways, he was pretty spot on.
Yeah.
He predicted the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union.
He saw that coming.
He did. He also recognized that these communist regimes would face a lot of challenges in trying to adapt to a rapidly changing world.
Like technologically?
For example, or the growing desire for individual freedom,
Okay.
self-expression, things like that.
But history is messy, right?
It is very messy.
Things don't always go according to plan.
Exactly. I mean, there were certainly things he couldn't have foreseen.
Yeah.
The specific events that contributed to the decline of communism,
Right.
the new challenges that emerged in the post-Cold War era.
Like globalization and the internet and
Yeah, the rapid spread of
yeah,
information.
all that stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, his analysis is valuable, but we have to view it through that historical lens.
Okay, so what are some of those timeless lessons that we can draw from his work that we can apply to today's world?
Well, I think his emphasis on the power of ideas
Right.
is incredibly relevant.
And the need to understand the other side.
Right. You can't just dismiss people who hold different views.
And the idea that people are drawn to these simple solutions
Yeah,
to really complex problems,
Exact-
that still happens today.
absolutely.
So yeah, it seems like this battle of ideas is never really over.
That's right.
And it's our responsibility to critically evaluate the information that we encounter,
Yeah.
challenge assumptions.
Be willing to engage in dialogue.
Yeah, and that's a really important point to end on, I think.
I agree.
Because engaging in these conversations, being willing to understand different perspectives,
Right.
that's how we build bridges
Yeah, it's how we move forward as a society.
and find solutions.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Nixon's perspective on communism.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been really fascinating. I think we've all learned a lot, and hopefully our listeners have as well. We encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.